In a ruling sending shockwaves around the world, the U.S. Supreme Court said Donald Trump's move to unilaterally impose tariffs exceeded his lawful authority. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, "The president asserts the extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope. In light of the breadth, history, and constitutional context of that asserted authority, he must identify clear congressional authorizations to exercise it." In response, the U.S. president said he was ashamed of members of the High Court. We have a lot to talk about, but we're going to be right here in the studio in Washington, D.C. with CGTN's Jim Spellman.
Really a stunning pushback on the president's power. In a 6-3 majority decision, the court finds that Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IEPA, passed back in 1977, does not authorize these types of broad-based tariffs. The decision finds that law was intended for serious pressing national security issues only. Trump has used a variety of rationales to justify these and other tariffs, arguing they would help bring down the U.S. trade deficit while pressuring other countries to fight drug trafficking. He's also used tariffs and the threat of tariffs to create general foreign policy pressure over a variety of issues. Trump notes that tariffs not put in place under IEPA remain in place, and the White House is moving to put new tariffs in place to replace the ones that are no longer valid. President Trump spoke to reporters a few hours after the decision was released.
We have alternatives, great alternatives. Could be more money. We'll take in more money, and we'll be a lot stronger for it. We're taking in hundreds of billions of dollars. We'll continue to do so. Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122, over and above our normal tariffs already being charged.
Those 10% tariffs will expire in 150 days unless Congress votes to extend them. During that time, the Trump administration will begin new tariff investigations, including under Section 301, meant to address specific trade disputes involving particular countries or products. Those investigations could result, Mike, in more permanent tariffs.
And of course, the big question, what about all this revenue collected over the last year?
So the Supreme Court ruling does not say one way or the other whether the U.S. government has to pay back the revenue generated by tariffs that it has already collected. We're talking about $175 billion in collected revenues, according to some estimates. Lawsuits are already underway from companies hoping for refunds. Trump says without Supreme Court guidance, the issue will likely be in litigation for years to come, and it's possible that particular issue could end up right back at the Supreme Court.
So we could see the people in the black robes busy again on this issue. Thank you, Jim. Well, to discuss this and much more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from San Francisco, Anthony Chan is the former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase & Company. Liang joins us from Oregon. She's chair professor of economics at Willamette University. Out of Maryland, Sourabh Gupta is the senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. And in Tampa, Jeffrey Swartz is a law professor at the Cooley Law School and a former county court judge in Florida. So why don't we start with you, Jeff? I was listening to analysts yesterday on a financial network. They were all saying they expected some kind of ruling today, and they kind of expected to go sort of this way. But the Supreme Court's been rather unpredictable when it comes to trying to predict what they're going to do. What was your reaction when you heard the news?
Well, I really wasn't surprised. First of all, the fact that the chief wrote this opinion and was in the majority didn't surprise me. Think back to the Obamacare decision that he made, where he found that the payment of penalties for not getting insurance was a tax. And that's exactly what he wrote here. He made it very, very simple, that the president does not have the right to assess a tax against citizens of this country or taxpayers in this country. That's up to the revenue makers, and that is the House of Representatives. I also wasn't surprised with the separation of powers, the way that he interpreted them, and the way that he applied the major question doctrine, basically saying that if the Congress wanted the IEPA to be something the president could wield this way, they would have put it into the statute.
And Anthony, you wrote about this in November in Substack, and you got into the implications of what would happen. And I don't want to go into the weeds because I read it, and you're talking about Section 122 and Section 301, and we've already heard Jim talking about that, and the president. But he still does have some levers, doesn't he?
Yes, Mike, he does have quite a bit of leverage. There's another five trading authorities. But the reason why he didn't use those, Mike, is because they're a lot clunkier. They're a lot more challenging. Some of them are temporary, like the one he imposed today with the 10%. It's only good for 150 days. Others require investigations. When you're dealing with over 200 countries, just to imagine that you have to make all these investigations for each of these countries, and then you have to do the investigations for different products, it becomes very, very challenging to do that. So the reason that he didn't take that route is very straightforward, and that is because it's not straightforward, it's not that flexible. And when you're negotiating and you want to make a decision quickly, you can't say, if you don't agree, I will conduct an investigation that will last months, and then we'll find out if I really get my way or not. That's not a real strong bargaining point. That's why the president didn't use it. And with regard to the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, all you have to go is to look at these IEEPA tariffs are about 60% of all the tariffs that are collected. Even the Border Patrol is giving you a much lower number, and that's the government, U.S. government agency. So the numbers are big, but not as big as you hear from the president.
Anthony, those who watch the stock market say that the one thing they hate is uncertainty and chaos, and they were really looking forward to a ruling that would provide some clarity. And then we watched the markets today, and people were saying, oh, this will give it a jolt. But we saw a dip and then rebound. It was fluctuating. What do we read into all of that?
I think what you read into that is that the status quo hasn't changed. And also, if you look at the international betting markets, let's say Poly market, they were forecasting a 74% probability that the Supreme Court would strike down these tariffs. So when you got the results, it was not really a big surprise. And remember, financial markets move on surprises, not on actions that were anticipated or expected by the market. This action was clearly expected by the market. You heard from the esteemed lawyer, Jeffrey Swartz, that he was not surprised. Well, guess what? The markets were not surprised either.
Yeah, Jan, though, looking at things, just kind of doing a deep dive, the e-commerce retailers, Amazon, Etsy, just to name a few, did see a bump. Also, tech companies like Apple climbed as well. So as you survey the landscape, who are the winners today?
Well, good to be with you, Mike, and panelists. Well, I think the stock market, I would say, boom today is probably going to be short-lived because I think there's still so much uncertainty when it comes to how these tariffs are going to go, and especially also what happened to these existing tariff revenues that have been collected. I'd agree with other panelists. First of all, this is not a surprise. This is a very ambiguous law that was being used to levy this very sweeping tariff. It was supposed to only use to deal with adversaries and using financial sanctions, blocking financial dealings, or impose sanctions and so on and so forth. It's not a justification of imposing tariffs, a major tax on mostly U.S. firms and consumers, as we know that the Federal Reserve at New York has shown that 90% of these tariffs are pretty much paid by U.S. consumers and firms. So in that sense, I think that the rule that this tariff is actually illegal, I think it does give the temporary boost to the market. Because we have seen how this tariff has damaged the U.S. economy. When you look at the consumer prices, and you look at the manufacturing jobs, that actually has gone down by 11,000 jobs since Donald Trump took office. And you also look at the trade deficit. In terms of goods deficit, it has actually not decreased. It actually expanded to $1.24 trillion last year, which is a 2% increase. And then you looked at 2025, the GDP growth rate now is estimate to be 2.2%, which is the lowest since 2020. So when Trump said that his tariff is helping the U.S. to become the hottest economy in the world, I don't think that really meet the test of the reality. Now, again, I would also agree with Anthony that the president is exploring other possibilities. He has thrown out this alphabet soup, right? Section 201, Section 122, Section 232, and 338 and 301, so on and so forth. But none of these other acts would give him the authority to really impose a kind of very sweeping and very enduring kind of tariffs without due process. So, but then again, by different sectors or by different countries, and also by different amount, he does he is going to explore all these possibilities. So I think that would again give a lot more uncertainties to markets. Not to mention, he has been using tariffs as a major foreign policy tool. So now the question also is, what other countries are going to do now if these tariffs now become illegal? And so I think that really opened a can of worms. And also all these litigations to maybe to try to get back of this tariff being levied. So I think this, again, just adds a lot more uncertainty going forward when it comes to the market.
And Sourabh, Trump said back in 2024, it's not going to be a cost to you, it's going to be a cost to another country. As Jan was just pointing out, that simply is not what we're finding in the statistics here. These tariffs were supposed to bring in revenue and revitalize U.S. manufacturing, but we know that it's hurt a number of sectors. And you can look at the auto market, for example. I mean, parts are coming from Mexico, they're coming from Canada and ending up in Detroit to assemble those cars. And so we're seeing some areas and industries that were really hurt by this, right?
Oh, absolutely, we're seeing, and I think Mr. Trump and his assistants know that, and that's why in about late August, mid-September, there were massive exemptions written into these tariffs. I mean, half the tariff lines, are coming in at much lower values, it's at much lower tariff rates, et cetera, et cetera. We've got studies, of course, now showing that, most understandably are being borne by small and mid-sized businesses, by consumers, by importers. And as every economics professor says, it has more to do with investment, consumption, balances rather than tariff rates. At extreme tariff rates, you can have trade embargoes, of course, but otherwise it is about consumption demand in your country. The US has had a good year in terms of consumption, and it has sucked in a lot of imports, and that's why there is this huge trade deficit. And of course, as we talked in terms, manufacturing, it takes time to stimulate manufacturing. It just doesn't happen overnight the way Trump thinks or wants it to be. And there will be some manufacturing through his by coercing his trade partners to invest out here, the Japanese, et cetera, South Koreans. The Japanese are already ahead of the queue in this regard, and we will see some announcements this next month. But that takes time, and Mr. Biden had already started that process through the Inflation Reduction Act, which Mr. Trump killed. So, this has just been, I'll put it frankly, the way Mr. Obama talked about Mr. Trump in a different context, this is a clown show that he's holding, and the consequences are becoming aware, and it's become clear now.
Well, Jeff, let me talk to you about companies lining up attorneys to try and get some of this money back. We're hearing that a coalition of small businesses, about 800 of them, are hoping to get immediate refunds on these tariffs paid. But we had a partner at the law firm, Wiley Rain, weighing in on this. Let's listen to what she has to say, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
In the near term, it actually, it's a little unclear as to the timing and ramifications of this opinion. The Supreme Court didn't explain who is eligible for refunds or how this order will be implemented. It's leaving that to the lower courts. And so this will go back ultimately to the Court of International Trade to describe the relief and put this opinion into action. So that's so there's some question marks there about as to the tariffs in place, when are they actually going to come off at the border? When is it going to be implemented? And when and how would refunds potentially be available to importers?
Some questions indeed. It sounds rather messy. It might be a bit of a quagmire, huh?
Well, that was part of the dissent that was written by Justice Kavanaugh when he was pounding on the table and he didn't really have any facts or law on his side. I think that what ultimately you have to accept is in the majority opinion, it was clear that the person who is paying the tax, for lack of a better way to put it, is the ultimate consumer. And that ultimate consumer is the party that's really entitled to the refund that they get. That's exactly what these retailers, these large retailers in particular, are trying to get that money so that they will have it when their customers come in and say, here's my receipt, how much of this was a tariff, and I want my refund. If you bought a car like I did a month ago, I'm going to go rushing into the car dealer and saying, how much of this money that you charged me for this car was for the tariff? So ultimately, lower courts are going to have to decide just a mechanism for the return, not necessarily who's going to get the return. For retailers that absorbed it, that is the tariff, and did not pass it along, then they're going to be entitled to the refund. So whoever paid it, the last one who paid it, that's who gets the money back. That's got to be the way it's going to work.
Anthony, we've already talked about Wall Street, but let's talk about Main Street. I know this is anecdotal, but my wife and I have this restaurant we go to all the time. One night we went in there and the place is being stocked with boxes everywhere. And I was asking the owner, what's up? It's a mom and pop operation. And they were like, the tariffs are coming. We're buying all of these products in advance because we know the prices are going to be jacked up. They get a lot of their products from like Vietnam, Cambodia, China. But you know that only lasts for a few months, and they were afraid to raise their prices. And I think about these small businesses, the mom and pop operations where, you know, the pressures were intense. What's happened with them?
Well, clearly, all you have to do is look at employment. If you look at the ADP report, what you find is that you had the most uncertainty in the small businesses. They were reluctant to hire workers because they were with the least flexibility. The large companies had a lot of flexibility. They can cut costs. They can spread out the cost of the tariffs among different products. In fact, some anecdotal evidence from Federal Reserve surveys indicated that large companies, what they were doing is maybe not passing on all the tariffs and the products they were selling, but they were actually raising the price in some products that were not even tariffed in order to spread it out. But again, when you have a large company with thousands of products, and of course, we know the big box stores, the Amazons of the world, those are the ones that have that sort of flexibility. But a small business doesn't have that flexibility. So sadly, what they did, and in fact, it's not something I'm telling you they did, the data shows it, is that employment growth was a lot more sluggish in these small businesses because of all this uncertainty. And then as to, I agree with a lot of the people that are saying, Professor Liang, all those comments are all true. But the reality is that there's more uncertainty with this tariff decision because it's easy to say, oh, we're just going to give the money back if we ever give it back and we just give it back to the consumers. Well, some of it was absorbed by the companies, some of it was absorbed by the consumer. And it's very challenging to be able to prove what share was the consumer, what share was the other one. And even the New York Federal Reserve study, which I read, or 90%, there were 7 studies and they all range from 90 to 96%. So even there's not uniform. Yes, a lot of it was, in fact, passed on to the consumer in some way, not even just the tariff goods, sometimes in goods that were not even tariffed, and they pushed some of the tariffs in there. But again, the small business on Main Street, less flexibility than the large business. And that was pretty sad because at the end of the day, small businesses end up hiring over 80% of all the jobs. Maybe one reason why employment growth has slowed down also.
Yeah, they certainly are taking a hit and very nervous. Jan, let's talk about Trump's tariff policies, very aggressive towards China, of course, and a trade agreement was made. But what about all those tariffs on Chinese imports already paid? And how do you think China is going to respond to this?
Well, again, I think that a lot of these tariffs are paid by American consumers and businesses, as we just talked about. But clearly, a lot of these tariffs are imposed on China. They're not covered by the ERP, right? Because there's the fentanyl-related tariffs, but also in terms of the so-called reciprocal tariff. So those are going to be, now it should be ended because it is ruled as illegal. Now, there's other tariffs that are imposed on China that is under the Section 301, which is the so-called unfair trade practices. And I think there are also sectoral kinds of tariffs that are also being imposed that is under the Section 232 in the name of national security. And that has to do with steel, aluminum, automobiles, and wood products and others. So I would say it would be a major relief once these reciprocal and fentanyl-related tariffs are ruled as illegal. So in other words, China, Mexico, and Canada, the 3 countries that are under the kinds of fentanyl-related tariffs under these IAPA law would now it should be removed. So I think that would be a good, I would say, a welcome sort of move from China and other countries that are being imposed this tariff. Now that said, I think there are much other issues when it comes to China and the United States. And we know that there is a scheduled visit of President Trump to China. And so I think what China is concerned about is not just the tariff issues, but a wide range of other issues like tax restrictions and also, companies that are being put on some of these blacklists. So I think there are still a lot of, I would say, tensions when it comes to the two countries' relationships, when it comes to trade, investment, and others. But that definitely the current ruling as these fundamentally related and reciprocal tariffs as illegal. I think that will, again, a sort of an advantage for China because it will allow China to gain more leverage, so to speak, when it comes to trade negotiations for going forward.
Sourabh, let's talk about leverage because this has really been a tool that the U.S. president has used quite a bit. It's either get in line or get tariffed, and a lot of people see it as a kind of a bullying mechanism. He's used it all over the place. And as a result, we've seen countries like Canada go to China and get deals done, and a number of countries' leaders going to China in just the last month or so. So it seems as though he's weakened in that regard, but it also seems like maybe he's sent other people elsewhere to get deals done. I mean, what's the landscape look like, in your opinion?
From the get-go, it was understood that the U.S. was coercing its trade partners, and the trade partners must look elsewhere, particularly those who were committed to the multilateral trading system, because what Mr. Trump was doing is complete violation of international trade law, international treaty law. And of course, so countries have been have swallowed this understanding that Mr. Trump is violating international trade law, WTO law. So they are not as concerned as to what's happening in the U.S. This is more in terms of the U.S.'s constitutional integrity and the separation of powers and et cetera, et cetera. So, that's a separate issue. And for the countries involved, they are really they don't care so much. Yeah, you have Indonesia today on the very day that this has been announced, signing something with the administration with regard to reciprocal tariffs. Now, one point I would make where I would disagree with most of the panelists is that actually Mr. Trump has a lot of can come back fast and soon against many of these countries. He is, anyway, as he mentioned, going to impose 10%, which can be taken up to 15% on the basis of Section 122, which can last for 6 months. I am sure if the Democrats win in Congress, they will also wink at it and keep extending it. The Democrats are just as protectionist, although not as wild as Mr. Trump is. But here's the more damaging point. This is with regard to Section 301. There are 10 or 15 major trading partners with which the U.S. has significant deficits. The Trump administration can initiate investigations tomorrow against 10 of these partners, 15 of these partners, and within a couple of weeks find that the trade deficits or the surpluses that it ran with the US are unjustified and unreasonable as per Section 301. And then you can have tariffs to any number. Mr. Biden put tariffs of 100% on Chinese EVs. Mr. Trump will just use that same authority. It's just going to be delayed by a few weeks. So the fact of the matter is he can come back hard, and he will come back hard. And many investigations can happen very fast, and that's why the markets have not been overjoyed by what they're seeing, because they know this is a process, and that process, at least in terms of the tariffs on foreign partners, Mr. Trump is likely to win in that regard. And therefore, the foreign partners, coming back to your original question, are finding ways to make the best out of the situation, which means try to uphold the system, try to deepen their relationships. And think of a country like India, which I think played a smart role. Mr. Trump wants it to bring its industrial tariffs down to zero. India was very reluctant because India is a protectionist country. If we have to do it for Mr. Trump, we might as well plurilateralize it and do it with the Euros also. So they did a deal with the Europeans. At the end of the day, India will be a beneficiary from bringing its tariffs down, and the US will be a loser by by putting up a tariff wall against India. So matters are a little complicated, but that's how the trade partners are moving forward at this point.
Jeffrey, let me kind of riff off of what he just said. The Supreme Court saying congressional approval is needed, but as Sourabh was pointing out, and the president was pretty defiant when he was talking to reporters, he can figure out end arounds and still keep things in place. Is that your sense as well?
Well, yeah, some of this has been talked about, 201, 301, 232. All of these provisions, though, have conditions precedent to their application. And in the case of 301, you have to remember that, like so many of these other penalties, but more so under 301 than the others, the cost is going to be passed on to the importer. It's going to be passed on to the consumer. And that seems to be the biggest problem that Mr. Trump has right now. Now, legally, he may be able to do it, but I don't see Congress, who all of them stand for election this coming fall, are going to want to start putting on these very heavy tariffs that are going to be passed on, where the question is, as Mr. Trump says, affordability and living and the cost of living. And with the decreases in certain things that we saw in the economy, I don't know that the economy can stand the kind of tariffs that he thinks he can impose under 301. But yes, he can do it, but there's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of places this has to go, a lot of determinations that have to be made. I don't think 2 weeks is a reasonable span. Yeah. If he's going to do it, it's going to be within the next couple of months. And now he's into the primary season, and I don't know that he wants to do it. This is his off-ramp, and this may be the way he gets off the tracks.
All right, Anthony, we got about a minute left. GDP in the U.S. Grew by only 1.4% in the fourth quarter, rather anemic. Your thoughts on that? What's behind it?
Well, it really was the trade deficit. As Professor Liang mentioned, we didn't see an improvement in the trade deficit. And in fact, the trade deficit numbers came in one day before the release of the real GDP numbers. So when you put that number into the formulation in trying to forecast GDP, it wasn't a real surprise, because that, along with the government shutdown that subtracted about 1.1% off real GDP and the trade deficit, that's why you got the weak number. The good news is that consumer spending was still pretty robust. The bad news is that inflation numbers came in a little bit higher, both in the GDP deflator and, of course, the core personal consumption deflator and the personal consumption deflator, which are the Federal Reserve's favorite inflation indicators. Those came in a little bit too hot, which means that the Federal Reserve, in some sense, has less flexibility. The only silver lining is that if these tariffs come down and it lowers inflation, the Fed has a little bit more flexibility.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much. Big day here in Washington. Thank you for your insights and helping us to distill exactly what's going on. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat.